So I am sure that you have heard this statement before. I'm spiritual, but not religious. And maybe you feel that to be true for yourself, or maybe you have a loved one who has said that, or maybe someone at the grocery store, I'm spiritual, but not religious. And I think we have to really acknowledge, and I hope our conversation today acknowledges that religion has done a lot of harm, where people feel like they can't say that they're religious. So they say instead that they are spiritual. But our hope today is that together, what if we were able to acknowledge that we are all on a spiritual journey together, embarking on a spiritual journey that I think can lead to transformation together? What if?
So I want to say that I'm a big fan of religion. I grew up in the church, and I've always loved church. And, I used to say, well, I loved school, so I became a school teacher, and I love church, so I work in church. So I know that religion has done harm. But for me, I'm a walking example of religion having done good too. And so nothing is ever so simple as we would love to make it. But I want us to start with, I really want to drill down as to what you think a definition of spirituality is. So what do you think, Jamie?
Well, I think, first of all, we got to acknowledge, as we begin this conversation, that all three of us make our living off of religion. So let's just name that, right? So
I love religion. No,
yeah. So I think we do have to recognize that as we have this conversation, which I think is a positive in the sense that it allows us to speak to the challenges of it as well, not just the affirming aspects of it.
Because we have seen the underbelly of religion.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so, but back to your point about spirituality, for me, spirituality is about this longing to find purpose and meaning and something deeper in life than just, getting up, eating cereal, and going through the motions of the day. It's something about finding a higher purpose.
So is there
life.
Transcendence in your definition of
yes.
spirituality? What about you, Jenny?
Yeah, I like that a lot. I think if you were to ask a lot of people around my age about the difference between spirituality and religion, whether or not this is true or not, I think that they would say that religion feels like just a set of containers, pre-made containers that you have to conform to. Pre-made containers of beliefs, practices, rituals, identity, where spirituality is just this open, free container of exploration and adventure among spiritual reality. So in some sense, I think people would say that religion is almost a separation of life, of spirituality, whereas spirituality is a continuity of seeing, faith worked out in all aspects of life, if that makes sense.
And I think a little bit what you're saying too is, if you expand that idea, spirituality is really about the present, right? It's about just my present moment with this transcendent moment. But religion, yes, is about the present, but it requires a looking to the past with tradition and structures that we inherited.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because spirituality is about experience. And yet, I think we often think of religion not being about experience, but we can talk more about this later, but I think religion also includes experience to a degree, but it also includes tradition.
So my definition of spirituality was one that I actually looked up online, because I was like, I wonder what the experts think of it. But it was this idea of something greater than myself. But then when I began to sort of research spirituality and religion side by side, and what are the similarities and differences, I guess I could sum it up all as spirituality's internal truth, and religion can be some internal truth, but there's a lot of external truth that you inherit. We say the Apostles' Creed every week. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, et cetera, et cetera. And that's to sort of ground us in same thought, same foundation, unity, to create unity. some shared experiences. As spirituality, everyone's having their own lived experience, and they may have some similarities, but everybody's truth is different. And we'll get into this a lot more deeply when we do truth as one of our broken signposts. But so can y'all talk a little bit about that, about religion is this, and spirituality is this? Is there anything you can add to that?
Let me ask it this. Let me put it in a question. I feel like we can have, and people say it all the time, I'm spiritual but not religious. So it feels like you can have spirituality without religion, but can you have religion without spirituality?
Yes, I think you can.
Yeah. I think so.
I do think you can.
I think so. And I think that's where my generation, I don't want to paint with a broad stroke, but I think a lot of people who say that they're spiritual but not religious are frustrated with religion because religion has become so institutionalized. And again, going back to this idea of containers, it's become a Sunday morning faith without being filled over to the rest of the week.
Yes, N.T. Wright says we live in a functional atheism.
Yeah.
In his book, Broken Signposts, that we have an experience on Sunday morning that does not transcend to our political systems, our social structures, the way we treat one another necessarily, that we don't come out of the world and be separate. We look exactly like everyone else. And
so the Hebrew prophets talked about that. Is that isn't that where Isaiah and some of the minor prophets?
Yeah.
They talked about like you go through the form, but there's no
deny the power thereof.
Yeah.
God requires mercy, but not sacrifice. God wants your life, not just your burnt offerings. And so God doesn't want, or Isaiah 58 is all about, why are you fasting if what you're fasting for is only for selfish ambition and not to bring God glory?
Okay,
So
but
why
if
are
we're
you
gonna-
going to worship if you're going to worship to make a check in a checkbox saying you've done your duty for the week, but it's not spilling out to the rest of your week and your life, then God doesn't want you to be going to church on a Sunday morning
And so
just to do that.
Would that be
Yeah.
what being religious and not spiritual would look like?
I think so. I don't know. That's just me, though.
But yes, and so there's a lot of ego satisfaction in fulfilling your duty, and especially in my generation and older. They're the patriots. They're the ones who built the great nation. We get a lot of sense of fulfillment out of doing our duty, and so they're the backbone sometimes of the institutional church, and then spirituality seems to be like, I'm at one with everyone, so I don't need to be in an institution. We're all sharing this human experience, okay? And so if I was spiritual, if I was being an apologetic for spirituality, I would say religion divides, spirituality unifies, because we can share this fact that we're all human together. So...
And I don't think that's wrong, right? We've
No.
seen evidence of that.
Yeah.
So how do we transcend that and still see value in religion?
And so if I'm being an apologetic for spirituality, then I would say mine's authentic to me because I'm living authentically because I connect to the force, or I connect to this energy of power. Christians call it the Holy Spirit. A person who's spiritual but not religious may not would call it that, but they seem to have this inner peace, and those things. But what we know is that's a very solitary experience, right? And so one thing I do think that religion has going for it, it does bring people together. I love how C.S. Lewis describes it when he was the new convert and he goes to the church and everyone's so different from him, and he doesn't really know what to do with that, but he was like, there's beauty in having us together in this place doing this thing,
Yeah.
So
And there's something to be said about rituals, though. There is something.
Oh, yeah.
And Jenny, again, not to pinpoint your generation, but
Dun, dun, dun.
But I do think that that they kind of look down on rituals and habits. But there's something about there's something transforming about just creating ritual for our life. There's just something about the way we're that we're made that we need that.
I was about to say
That's
that's
valuable.
core to our human experience is this desire for ritual, for routine, for tradition. Hence why we have graduation ceremonies, from kindergarten and preschool and high school. Hence why we have a bedtime routine, or our family has traditions around holidays. We crave that ritual thing that has been carried on for generations upon generations. And so, yeah, we crave that to an extent, but at some point along the line or along the way, somehow those traditions lost its impact or its meaning for people.
That's a great point.
And it no longer became about what those traditions meant. It just meant, we've always done it. And so we need to always do it. And so what was the point behind that? What was, just a quick tangent. When I was a kid growing up, my family, it was during the housing market crash of 2008, the recession, and being the youngest of 5, we decided as we were getting ready to send 4 of my siblings through college that instead of buying each other gifts, we were going to make gifts or give something up. And that would really help us lean into the gift-giving spirit of Christmas. And so that's what we did. And it really helped us challenge what was the whole point of gift giving in the first place for Christmas season? Why were we giving gifts? And so then we had to really reflect on the meaning and the intentionality behind gift giving. And I think that's what religion and rituals is all about, is not the ritual itself, but the meaning behind the ritual.
And I don't think you can discount too the idea that religion and adherence to your religious doctrines requires an element of obedience, of submitting to something that's outside of yourself that I don't know necessarily always happens in spirituality. And this idea that we share some core beliefs and these beliefs are predefined, and that can be very threatening to someone who's not grown up that way, okay? And yet, for me, that was a great container to get me in a path where now I feel like I can incorporate elements of spirituality in, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, but I really want to talk about where does Christianity, not just religion, but the religion that the 3 of us actually share, the faith tradition of Christianity, how does Christ, Jesus, and specifically in John's gospel, how does that interface with religion, spirituality, and what's the value in that? Okay, and I'm looking to you, but it can be either one of you.
No, you got this one, Jane. Go for it.
I think what's
Speak to us, Yoda.
what's fascinating is Jesus, as a good Jew, there's 2 foundational elements of Hebrew theology, and that's the temple and Torah.
And what is Torah?
And so Torah is the 5 books of Moses. So it's the structure of it is the written word that for the people.
So it's the sacred place and it's the sacred text.
Correct.
Gotcha.
And so, but what's fascinating in the history of the Jewish people is that God's with the building of the temple, particularly the second temple, after exile and the return from exile, and there's this sacredness about this space that this place begins. But then you still had people that were still living in exile; they were still living in the dysphoria,
far away from the sacred place.
Correct. Okay. And so then the sacred text became of value. And you see that in some of the Psalms. The Psalm 19, I think, is one of them. Psalm 119 talks about just the value of the word being in your heart and renewing your mind and just that as sweet as honey, I think is what Psalm 19 says. And so there's a sacredness there. So even if you are living far away from the place where God resides, which is what the Hebrew people believed about the temple, was God's place of residence.
And the holiest of holies.
Yeah, and so if you live far away and don't have access to that, if you at least have access to the sacred text, then you have access to God as well.
But in the prophets like Ezekiel, Jeremiah, aren't you already getting a whiff of internal God, like the Spirit living? Because he says we will recreate in you this new heart. Dry bones are going to come up. You're going to, so what's it pointing to?
So yeah, in Ezekiel and Jeremiah, Jeremiah's speaking to exiled people and just really that longing for this something to be internal. And just something to be, and so fast forward to the New Testament, and we have Jesus on the scene, and particularly as N.T. Wright talks about John 3 and John 4, and at the very beginning of the Gospel of John, we're introduced, and maybe it was John 2, where Jesus is having this confrontation with the religious leaders
That's
about
where he
the
goes
temple.
and flips the tables, and then he says, "I'm gonna." You can destroy this temple. I'll build it up in 3 days.
And everyone's like, you can't build a temple in 3 days.
And Paul and John, just in case, for the people in the back who aren't listening, what he really meant was he was going to raise his body up in 3 days.
Yeah, John's giving us a little commentary of his,
I was thanks, John. We couldn't have figured that one out at all. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
But,
so I think so what Jesus begins to introduce for us then is this concept that he is going to replace the temple for God's presence, that Jesus is the presence of God among us. And so, which is fascinating because here is God being embodied in a human body, which we call the incarnation, which also talks about, so we think about the otherness of God, this outside, this God at a distance, but I mean, it's almost like God's at a distance and then there we are in the flesh, right there with Jesus, right? I mean, it's just this powerful moment. And then Jesus, as you go through the Gospel of John and you begin to pick up clues where Jesus starts talking about the Spirit and the Spirit of God and where the Spirit of God is going to reside. So not just in Jesus, but he says the Spirit of God also resides in us.
So you're not just Jesus and servant, you're Jesus and friend, Jesus and follower. What were you going to say?
It makes me think of John 4, the woman at the well, where they get into this discussion. And, first of all, they shouldn't have been talking. It was Jesus and a woman, which is like, well, you didn't do that. But then also it's Jesus, a Jew, and this woman who's a Samaritan. And those Jews and Samaritans didn't get along. Jews worshipped in one way at one place, Samaritans worshipped in another place in a different way. And Jesus is telling the woman, you worship over here, but one day you're going to be worshiping in spirit and truth. It's not going to matter where you are when you worship. I am the one that you are going to be worshiping, and I get to be with you in that worship.
And so what's coming to me right now is that Jesus seemed to be this perfect mesh or conflagration or whatever, I'm not sure what the word is, but of religion and spirituality, because can you speak a little bit to that Jesus was following a religion?
He was a Jew, and a good Jew. He knew his Torah. He knew the rituals of the temple. And
a lot of his teaching, what I didn't realize until I was reading N.T. Wright's book, was that a lot of his teaching is really hearkening back to what they already know.
Correct. A good Jew would have known,
and what we would know if we read the Old Testament more. Really.
Yeah, I think we've done a disservice as Christians in creating a sort of a duality between the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, and the New Testament. I think a better understanding is the Hebrew Scriptures and this revelation of Jesus.
Wait. You're saying that there's not two different gods, a God of the Old Testament and a God of the New Testament?
Have you heard that before?
Yes. Oh my goodness, that is a common thought.
Yeah.
No, I'm not. And
not two different gods, but like two different Really? Two different gods?
People think it's two different gods. It's not.
Okay.
You got an angry judgment God in the Old Testament, and then you got sweet, loving Jesus
I had
in the New
a conversation recently with someone who told me that they don't read the Old Testament because it's a different, and I'm like, no, it's not. And so it means it requires us to do.
But certainly the way that the people in those those sacred texts are relating to God changes.
Oh, of course. I mean,
Yeah.
and I mean, I think that changes throughout the whole entire canon of Old and New Testament, right? I mean, you can see that in the way Paul writes. We were talking off camera earlier about just the idea of what Paul's expectation of the return of Christ was going to be. And you see, if you put Paul in his chronological order, what he says in Thessalonians is going to be a lot different than what he says his letters to Timothy, for example. Thessalonians, y'all got to be ready. It's
Any day.
any day, right? Any moment, any second. It's like a thief in the night, I think is his language. By the time you get to Timothy, though, he's talking about structure and order and
For the church.
Longevity.
Yeah.
And so you don't talk that kind of language unless you have a mindset that has changed.
But was it not true that the Jews at that time thought they were living in the latter days? So that would make sense that they would write that way.
Correct.
Yeah.
But I think, when you say Jews, I mean, these are people who don't look to Jesus as the Messiah. So they're looking toward a Messiah. So their latter days is a Messiah coming to liberate, to ransom, to set free, and to set up God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven.
Gotcha. So let's close today's episode with Jamie. I'm going to look to you first, but Jenny, please weigh in. What get to the person who's spiritual or religious? What does Christianity, what does Jesus Christ have to offer that spirituality alone does not offer?
That's a great question. I think what Jesus has to offer, again, we go back to what Jesus, I worry about people who say that I'm spiritual but not religious, is that they devalue humanity. You can. I think that's possible because it all becomes sort of a Gnostic kind of thought process that is all about what's happening internally and stuff. And what Jesus does is that Jesus, by taking on flesh, by God taking on flesh in the incarnation, values humanity and a human experience. And I think that's important. I think what he does is he doesn't separate the secular and the sacred. And there's a huge confrontation in that moment, in the incarnation that reminds us. So we don't separate. I think sometimes spiritual but not religious, you may be trying to pull those two apart. And I think Jesus wouldn't let us do that.
Yes. And then his life, his crucifixion, his resurrection, and the belief in that, I think connects me internally to, we call it justifying grace. I mean, there is a sense within me that I need God's grace to live and to be like Christ. And there's this sense that he is making broken whole and wrong right. And being the friend of Jesus connects me to history, but leads me forward. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think too, you bring up a good point. I think that's why crucifixion and resurrection is central to our faith. And it wasn't a spiritual resurrection. We talk about a bodily resurrection, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's a powerful statement, and just in itself, because again, it values spirituality here on earth and what we're going through. I think it helps us. Jesus identifies with us in so many levels, and I think to me that is the good news of the gospel. And it opens us up, as he says in John 3, about the idea, the concept of being reborn, born from above, and so there's. That's central to who we are.
Yeah, I think that's a good place for us to end today.
I agree. Anything else y'all want to say before we close out? Any last thoughts?
I'm good.
We said everything we need to say. Well, Well, next time we gather together, let's dive deep into this thought of spirituality and Christianity. Can it coexist? What does that look like? I don't know. Let's talk more about it. But this week, as you go from watching this and hearing this conversation together, what if we were able to just acknowledge that we are all on this spiritual journey together? Acknowledge the harm of religion, but also acknowledge that maybe there's some stuff that we can learn from religion as well. Together, what if? If you have enjoyed this conversation, I invite you to do two things. I invite you to like and share this podcast on whatever platform you're listening, or this video on whatever platform you're watching. And as always, it's good to see you. See you next time.
There's a grace when the heart is under fire. Another way when the walls are closing in. When I look at the space between where I used to be and this reckoning, I know I will never be alone. There was another in the fire, standing next to me. There was another in the waters, holding back the seas. Should I ever need reminding of how I've been set free? There is a cross that bears the burden, where another died for me. There is another in the fire. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Jesus. All my dead led for death beneath the waters. I'm no longer a slave to my sin anymore. Should I fall in the space between what remains of me in this reckoning? Either way, I won't bow to the things of this world. And I know I will never be alone. There is another in the fire, standing next to me. There is another in the waters, holding back the seas. Should I ever need reminding, power set me free. There is a grave that holds nobody, and now that power lives in me. There is another in the fire. Whoa, there is another in the fire. Whoa, there is another in the fire. There is another in the fire. And I can see the light in the darkness as the darkness bows to him. I can hear the roar in the heavens as the space between was thin. I can feel the ground shake beneath us as the prison walls cave in. Nothing stands between us. Nothing stands between us. Nothing stands between me and Jesus. Nothing will ever stand between me and my God. There is no other name but the name that is Jesus. He who was and still is and will be through it all. So come what may in the space between all the things unseen and this reckoning, I know I will never be alone. Yes, I know I will never be alone. There'll be another in the fire standing next to me. There'll be another in the waters holding back the seas. Should I ever need reminding how good you've been to me, I'll count the joy come every battle, 'cause I know that's where you'll be. Is another in the fire. There is another in the fire. His name is Jesus. His name is the Lord of Lords, the King of Kings. There is another in the fire. There is another in the fire.